Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome to paper session 3, Latinx SF in the Archive. I'm Leigh Gold. I'm a doctoral lecturer in the English department at City Tech. I'm so happy to be here. It's a wonderful, as always, such a wonderful event. So I'm really thrilled to be on this panel, as I've been thrilled to participate over the past years of the symposia. So thank you so much. So just to briefly explain, this is a lightning round, this panel. So presenters will have no more than 15 minutes to present. And we will please save all of our questions for after both sessions. And as we've been doing throughout the day, you can please also leave your questions in the Q&A section, which we can find at the bottom of the Zoom window. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to start off by introducing our first presenter, who I hope is here. I assume so. Matthew David Goodwin. Matthew David Goodwin is an assistant professor in the Department of Chicano Studies at the University of New Mexico and assistant director of publications at the Southwest Hispanic Research Institute. He maintains the LatinxArchive.com. And he will be presenting the Latinx Multiverse and the Fictional Recovery of Latinx Science Fiction. Oh, hi, Matthew. Yes, I hope there you are. Hi, welcome.
Hello.
So take it away, Matthew.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so for a couple of years, I've been thinking about this field, Latinx science fiction, in a kind of science fictional way. So in some other universe or alternate timeline, Latinx science fiction was a key part of Latinx studies and science fiction studies from the beginning. And so in the present and reality, we're creating a kind of parallel to that world. In our universe, this comes about through what Pablo Brescia calls literary politics in regard to Latin American speculative fiction. But in this case, it's promotion, translation, anthologizing, and recovery. And then maybe a year ago, I read this book, The Lost Book of Adana Moreau by Michael Zapata, and it envisions a kind of a pivotal science fiction writer from the Dominican Republic, and kind of making this metaphor concrete. But it does raise the interesting possibility that a fictional character can have some significance to a recovery movement, and which is really not just about writing history, but also showing what was possible, and but was maybe not fulfilled because of various kinds of barriers. So what the field of Latinx science fiction is lacking, as far as we know, is an early Latinx science fiction novelist, like writing in the 19th or 20th century. Now, there is a very early science fiction writer, Luis Sanadens, a Cuban-American writer, who wrote an influential series of steam-driven robot stories, the Frank Reed Library. But he really had little control over these stories, which for young boys. Though there were hints every once in a while that he had a different perspective. What we do have is a fictional character that appears in The Lost Book of Adana Moreau, which is centered on Moreau, a Dominican immigrant living in New Orleans. Moreau's first novel, Lost City, from 1929, tells of the heroine's journey from the Dominican Republic to finding a portal to a parallel Earth. Moreau writes a sequel, A Model Earth, the Lost Book, and then burns it as she nears her too early death. But the story is not entirely lost, as Adana's son Maxwell reads the sequel before it's burned, and then recounts the book to his friend Benjamin, who many years later writes a reconstructed version. So at his death, Benjamin passes the book to his grandson Saul. Much of the novel really is set in the early 2000s, with Saul looking for Maxwell to give him the reconstructed Lost Book. So in the first place, the novel very clearly depicts Moreau as an extraordinary science fiction author. Benjamin, who reconstructs the book, praises it, her first novel as, quote, a great science fiction story. And referring to E. Doc Smith and Mary Shelley, he says that Adana Moreau was their equal, or maybe in some ways, she was even better. It's not said exactly what that even better refers to, but it makes the point even clearer that Moreau was a significant figure in science fiction history. Her publisher describes her as one of the greatest writers of this young century. And her name, of course, drives the point home. Though the Lost Book of Adana Moreau is not exactly an alternate history narrative, given that there's very little different in terms of the fictional world, there does seem to be this possibility that the fictional world has a stronger history of Latinx science fiction. Moreau's first novel, Lost City, mirrors Moreau's background. So she's born in the Dominican Republic, leaves after a catastrophe. She meets a man with gray eyes. They fight zombies. Eventually, they find the Lost City. There they find a portal, and the Dominicana travels through and ends up on a parallel Earth. She has a child with gray eyes. In the second novel, A Model Earth, the man with gray eyes follows her to the parallel Earth, but cannot find her. And just the caveat here is what is discussed here is the reconstructed model Earth. So we don't actually know what Moreau wrote. So the man with gray eyes discovers that this parallel Earth has many portals to other Earths, many Earths, all with different histories. The novel is then focused on the man with gray eyes as he travels through the multiverse, aiding a rebellion and so on. So the multiverse mirrors the many adventures of Moreau's husband, who is a pirate and has many adventures in the Caribbean. Moreau's cosmic vision of the multiverse is then inspirational for her son, Maxwell. Maxwell has an aptitude for math and science, but he also has this capacity to imagine worlds, and he becomes the kind of champion for the multiverse theory at a time when it was not, even a valid hypothesis. And so he writes a book called The Hidden Multitude, and it's received as an extremely theoretical scientific text, but without much evidence. But as it continues on, it influences the younger generation of scientists who are not so tied to the old theories. So the idea of the multiverse is also then inspirational to Saul, who's really at the center of the novel's narrative. Saul is somewhat stuck in life. He's in a job he's not excited about, and he jumps at this idea of returning the lost book to Maxwell. This very idea of the multiverse is influential to him. So near the end, he says, I think that the fundamental elegant variability of the multiverse, as Maxwell Moreau might say, finally forces me now to make choices I would otherwise never consider or even imagine. In that case, after finding Maxwell in New Orleans, he stays to help with the post-Katrina city. So the idea is that in this cosmology in which multiple versions of oneself are real, then there are all these possibilities right there. They're sort of made concrete. And the infinite possibilities can inspire us to at least think of a couple more than we normally do. Moreau is not the only fictional Latinx writer in the novel. Another is Thomas Flores. He's described as a Mexican-American science fiction writer who died in obscurity in Nevada in 1977. Now, in this case, as opposed to Moreau and Sonatins, there is actually a more similar kind of parallel figure, Arthur Tenorio. So Arthur Tenorio is the author of a novel, Blessing from Above, from 1971. Which tells the story of an alien who comes to Earth, secretly aids a fictional African nation in becoming prosperous. what's interesting is that this is actually the first Chicano science fiction novel, and it seems like it was self-published and by the Las Vegas, New Mexico School Press. So New Mexico, not Nevada, around the same time period though. And it was recognized that the novel was recognized early on as a kind of unique addition to Chicano literature. But it really didn't make it to the canon of Latinx literature, has never been studied academically, and the science fiction world ignored it entirely, as far as I can tell. And, you know, Tenorio did not die in obscurity, but the novel kind of did. So what's interesting is that, as far as I can tell as well, this is this edition by Zapata is totally something he made up, not related to the actual author from New Mexico. At any rate, this is not the end of the tale. Lost books have a way of coming out. So the truth is that the lost book of Adana Moreau is not entirely lost in the novel. Maxwell, who adds what he cannot remember, tells the story to Benjamin, who definitely makes changes in the story. Benjamin rewrites a novel, gives it back to Maxwell. So the original book does not exist as such, but what does exist is this collectively written novel of family and friends. In a world full of migrants and orphans and the challenge to find meaning, there are these stories that we make and we tell each other. And the Lost Book of Adana Moreau is a product of this interweaving of people and cultures, a kind of multiverse of social worlds, a meaning of the multiverse that appears throughout the novel, as the characters constantly encounter other people from different nationalities and ethnicities, and they always do it through storytelling. So one story will ignite the story of another. Zapata's novel, The Lost Book of Adana Moreau, in this sense, is a parallel world to the reconstructed Lost Book of Adana Moreau. And to conclude, given the existence of an infinite multiverse, we must imagine that the Lost Book of Adana Moreau is nonfiction in another universe. In another universe, Moreau is real, but does not burn the novel. In another, she lives until she's 100 years old, writing 25 novels, inspiring countless Latinx writers to write science fiction, creating a stronger legacy of Latinx science fiction than in our own universe. It's true that we don't have Adana Moreau, but certainly she could have existed, and the Lost Book of Adana Moreau envisions this possibility. What we have is the fictional Adana Moreau and all of her incredible capabilities and experiences and the knowledge she gains throughout her journey. She inspired no one before her birth in 2020, but she certainly can now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to go get this book.
It's a good book, yeah.
I mean, it sounds amazing. I have several questions. We'll wait. Thank you so much. So on to our next presenters. There are two, and they are Dolores González Ortega and Valeria Seminario. I'll just read their brief bios. Dolores González Ortega is a PhD candidate from Mendoza, Argentina. She holds a bachelor degree in literature and Spanish language teaching from the Universidad Nacional de Cuyo and an MA in literatures, languages, and cultures from the University of Connecticut. Her research interests focus on the interactions of gender, sexuality, and politics in contemporary Latin American science fiction. She co-organizes the interdisciplinary science fiction critical theory study group, Alien Readings, at the University of Pennsylvania. Valeria Seminario's research explores the encounter between literature, science, and technology in Latin American modernities and is increasingly becoming interested in the aesthetics of infrastructure and logistics. She is the author of Un pasado inevitable, La corriente del Golfo y la reescritura de los orígenes de la República Cubana in the edited volume Ficción y Ciencia from 2022. Valeria is a PhD candidate in the Department of Hispanic and Portuguese Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She holds an MA from the University of Pennsylvania and an MA in Interdisciplinary Studies from NYU. Her MA thesis, which recovers from obscurity the first Cuban science fiction novel, was prized with the Hirshhorn Master's Project Award by the Center for Experimental Humanities and Social Engagement at NYU. They will be presenting Inside the Latin American Science Fiction Archive, Challenges and Contributions to a Growing Academic Field. Welcome. Sounds very exciting.
Thank you, Leigh.
Yes.
So this presentation is a very abridged version of an ongoing investigation about the challenges and contributions archives pose to Latin American science fiction scholarship. We are both specializing in this field, and we became interested in how access to materials, canon formation, and the debate on literary labels impacts the development of science fiction as an academic field. So we approach these questions actually from the perspective of literary scholars interested in archives, and not as archive specialists interested in science fiction. Something important about Latin American science fiction studies is that for a long time, it strongly relied on list crafting. The genre consolidated through the proliferation of anthologies, chronologies, catalogs, and bibliographies that mapped a neglected corpus into Latin American cultural histories, and at the same time proved that science fiction has been a global endeavor from its earliest days. These lists and anthologies have a considerable impact on the field, which has been growing vertiginously over the last 20 years. And yet, access to materials is still very difficult. The archive appears as the next step in the attempt to recover and trace the history of the genre. For this reason, we decided to explore two different forms of collecting that stem from the recognition of the challenges to access the sci-fi corpus, as well as from an attempt to materialize these lists. These collections seek to bridge the gap between the titles that populate the bibliographies and catalogs and the readers and researchers who pursue access to actual science fiction texts. We have interviewed the heads of two unparalleled and very little known collections. The first one is the Latin American Science Fiction Special Collection at the University of South Florida. That is an institutional collection that houses around 3,000 titles. The second collection is a private and self-financed collection owned by Carlos Abraham, an Argentine scholar and writer, and consists of 2,500 titles. Side by side, our interviews revealed a complex panorama and guided us through the intricate world of collecting and archival practices in different contexts. We'll begin first with a collection at the University of South Florida. This collection was born around 2009, almost accidentally, when the Dean of Libraries and the Director of Special Collections stumbled upon a lot of 250 volumes of Latin American science fiction at a book fair in Mexico City. As Melanie Griffin, who was the curator of the collection between 2010 and 2018, told us, they recognized the lot as dovetailing nicely with their already existing science fiction collection and USF's wider interest in the Caribbean and Latin America. An internal document written by Griffin laid out the rich possibilities of this collecting area and affirmed that although, and I quote, some science fiction collections at other repositories, especially those at the University of Kansas and UC Riverside, include examples of foreign or other science fiction, none seem to be collecting Latin American science fiction systematically. This decision coincided with an increasing interest in the genre, and it was conceived as a way to provide a foundation for the development of a rising field. Referring to recent scholarly publications, Griffin said that recovery work cannot happen if texts are not available for consultation, and the development of this collection would provide a unique tool for such work. Even more, she saw the collection as a possibility to broaden the conversation within the US, where, as she claimed, rules, and I quote, a very insular view of the genre. Regarding acquisitions, one of the issues with this collection was the fact that it never had a curator that was specialized either in Latin American studies nor science fiction. To counter this lag, the library sought the advice of specialists in the countries where it had collecting interests. and establish contact points and networks to track and acquire material. Besides the advisors and connections, as Griffin recalls, and I quote, a lot of it was just luck, just being in the right place at the right time. The current situation of the Latin American science fiction special collection constitutes a revealing paradox. While interest in Latin American science fiction production and research has been increasingly growing for the last 20 years, the world's most important collecting initiative on the topic has suddenly stopped actively expanding and acquiring new materials. Today, despite the efforts of some faculty members of the university, like Professor Pablo Brescia, to promote the collection and to bring together a sci-fi research community, the collection is not attracting the expected interest of researchers and the general public. According to Dr. Brescia, the university considered that the universe of Latin American science fiction studies was too specific, and that the library needed to spend its financial resources on something broader and more popular. This situation unveils the tension that exists between the library's desire for acquiring popular and mass culture materials, and at the same time, for creating an original and outstanding research niche that could increase the university's prestige by attracting scholars from all over the continent. While the creation of the general science fiction collection in the 70s was explicitly motivated by the popularity of this mass culture genre, the Latin American science fiction special collection ended up being, according to the library's management, too exotic or too specific for the US context. Pablo Brescia, however, has high hopes for this collection. In his opinion, the contemporary effervescence of Latin American science fiction in the continent has partially renewed the attention devoted to the collection. Additionally, he is trying to create a community outside of USF that could use and value the collection in hopes that the university would reactivate funding. It is also necessary to discuss the ethical challenges that are involved in the practices of acquiring foreign materials. As Melanie Griffin explained, a considerable portion of the materials that were bought in Latin America consisted of first editions or only copies of rare books. The university was fully aware of this issue, and I quote, "Something that was really important to us, said Melanie Griffin, was that we were an institution in Florida taking materials out of Latin America. It was a delicate matter, and we were trying to figure out ways to not just be taking from, but to be participating in the conversation and giving something back," end of quote. But at the same time, Brescia argued, bringing the materials to the United States was seen as a way of protecting them, of making sure they were correctly preserved and made accessible to the public. Initiatives like the creation of a travel grant and a Latin American science fiction journal, as well as the project of digitizing the collections, can all be seen as valuable steps towards creating a sort of more decolonized version of the archive.
Oh, thank you, Valeria. The other project we'll discuss today is Carlos Abraham Personal Collection. After finding a rare 19th century science fiction book, he decided to follow his passion. Abraham's mission was not modest. As he told us, he, and I quote, wanted to collect all the sci-fi material published in Argentina. He saw his practice as a preservation endeavor, and throughout the whole interview, he evidenced an anxiety about the fragility of the material, which he attributes to a lack of archival culture in the science fiction medium. Abraham's acquisition was a meticulous and painstaking process that involved everything from archival work, developing deep networks of specialists, generating indexes, or even contacting writers' descendants after finding them on the phone book. His collecting work led to academic interest, and academic interest, in turn, fueled his collecting passion. In 2004, he founded Nautilus, a specialized Latin American sci-fi magazine, which furthered the conversation about the genre. Through the magazine, Abraham began to contact other investigators and discovered that in every country, there was a private collector like him that was a specialist on the genre. And I quote, "If one focuses on the national libraries of different Latin American countries, one realizes that they are not that strong in terms of sci-fi materials. So the scholar has no other choice than to start collecting himself or contact private collectors, who are the ones who actually have the deepest knowledge on the topic," end quote. His expertise led him to obscure material to which, as he himself said, academia was nowhere near. Outside of institutionality, however, this expertise encountered numerous obstacles. Abraham admitted that his own financial resources to acquire and hold materials were quite limited, since his funding comes from his job as a professor and from the books he has published. Limited space also constitutes a big challenge, as he keeps his collection in his family residence. Given the situation, he has thought about donating his collection, but the lack of institutional support in countries like Argentina does not offer a solution. Abraham denounces that for the libraries in the country, donations are just not a priority. He wonders about the future of his collection. Which institution will be suitable for it? Will the institution eventually discard it because of lack of space? In short, will these valuable materials be there for other researchers in the future? In the course of our interviews, we discovered that the factors contributing to the formation of these collections were more varied and arbitrary than we initially thought. The Latin American science fiction collection proved to be an illuminating example of how highly structured institutions can also be affected by fortuitous and unexpected changes. As for Carlos Abraham collection, it allowed us to take a closer look into the mysterious universe of private sci-fi collectors and the relationship they develop with bigger collecting organizations. He showed us how important his archaeological practice is for finding and preserving works that would be otherwise lost under the pile of dust of second-hand bookstores, an image that made us reflect on the impact that individual actions may have on a whole academic field. Although the uncertainty that the collector experiences is, in many cases, conditioned by the geographical context, it is also wide-ranging, and it spans throughout the whole continent. These issues draw our attention toward the genre itself and prove that the practice of collecting Latin American science fiction is everywhere hunted by the threat of disappearance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. I'm going to open up the floor now for questions that we can put in the Q&A, and I'll wait and see if anyone posts. But I actually, since no one has posted yet, as far as I can see, I can start off with the question. And this actually can be answered, I think, by all of you. And that is, it's really interesting, this idea of the anxiety of collecting, and this has come up in different ways in other sessions today, the questions of ethics, and I'm just thinking also of Archive Fever by Jacques Derrida comes to mind for me. But anyway, I want to ask, what are some solutions maybe that, if that's even possible to ask that question, that you found, and how can we kind of use that anxiety that you've discussed and that Abraham is discussing, perhaps to better understand or face these challenges of the Latinx SF archive, or collecting and recovery?
Can you repeat the last part of your question?
And Matthew, if you want to, chime in on this, of course, as well. I'm just wondering, how can we make use of this anxiety of which Abraham speaks? Is there a way, does this help us somehow to face these challenges? Have either of you or any of you sort of some solutions that you've thought of? I'm sure you have thought of many solutions. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about either of those 2 points.
Yeah, I would say anxiety sort of fuels the collecting desire first. If there's no danger to the archive, then there's no archive, sort of. So yeah, I mean, first, anxiety is useful. And then what to do once you sort of collected and amassed materials. I think that everyone we spoke to sort of coincided in the need to digitize materials mostly. That's the only way to sort of bridge like borders, or just deal with issues of collecting in certain places and not in others, or what do you do with a personal collection if no one has access to it? It's a super valuable collection. Then I guess digitizing for most of them was one of the ideals and utopias of the collecting practice itself.
Yeah, I guess I would just point to the idea of a lot of the stuff is ephemeral anyway. So it's true that there's a lot of anxiety about recovering and archiving, and but I don't know, at the end of the day, everything will sort of pass away anyway. Not to be kind of pessimistic about it, but there's an idea that a lot of early science fiction was written anonymously, and so we don't even know who actually wrote them. And so I don't know. I think that's just one part of the story, is that I guess I would be a little skeptical of the idea of that we need to archive everything, that everything needs to be finally contained and organized and understood. You know, I think there's a lot of gaps, and that's just the way it is. And it's part of the reason I like this book that I was talking about, is that it just sort of makes up a figure, you know, and that's another, I guess another approach is that, you know, when there are gaps, or, you know, just sort of make it up. I guess I'm thinking about some of the work of the Chicano artist Lalo Alcaraz. So he used to make these fictional movie posters for like Latino science fiction films. And I mean, they're fantastic as just little, you know, political cartoons. But part of the reason he did them is that those films didn't exist. Like US Latinx science fiction films. There's really, I mean, honestly, there's just Sleep Dealer even today. But this was in the 90s. And so that's I don't know, it's a kind of make-do aesthetics, you know, do it yourself. When there's a gap, just fill it in, not with reality, but with your imagination, I guess is the idea.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, go ahead, sorry.
I would probably add also that perhaps we can think about this anxiety being more strong in countries that are desperately trying to inscribe themselves in a global genre as well, right? I guess it's easier to say, let's just leave gaps when you're sort of mainstream or in the center of the discussion, right? But then I think there's a more a greater imperative sort of to fill all the gaps you can to show that you also have a history in science fiction. I guess that's a lot of what has been fueling this collective impulse and lists crafting and chronologies, right, anthologies throughout Latin America, right? Actually, I would see it as an attempt to feel like every gap that there is, and also fill it with things that sort of might not very easily fit into like the genre, right? Like there's a lot of more flexibility and ease, just because we need to like create this great tradition, or I don't know.
Yes, I don't see any other. I have one question, but I also want to Jason had wanted you, Matthew, if you could tell us more about your Latinx Visions event next year. I mean, we still have 10 minutes, but I just want to make sure before more questions are asked, if you could share a little bit about that event.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things I wanted to mention. So there's actually a US Latinx science fiction archive being developed at the University of California in Fullerton.
Oh, wow.
Probably, I mean, at least officially the first. Maybe they exist in other places. And of course, there's the Latin American one, but this one's focused on US Latinx science fiction. So that's interesting. They have I don't know if they have a website up yet, but they're putting together a lot of information to kind of make it accessible to people. So that might be of interest to you all. But yeah, so in March we're planning a conference, the Latinx Visions conference, and this is sort of part of the idea. Is a lot of the scholars working on US Latinx science fiction have been doing like panels over the years, and with this and that conference, and we've never kind of gotten together. And so we're finally kind of all get together and talk and see if we can kind of take stock of the field a little bit, where things are at and where things are going. And yeah, it's very exciting. We've got, futurist exhibits in town, a number of different performances, and I think like 20 something panels. Yeah, it's going to be pretty intense.
That sounds wonderful. That's really exciting.
Yeah.
I hope, yeah, I would love to. I'm sure it'll be accessible online, so I hope I can attend.
Well,
it's
so it's definitely free and open to the public. How much we're going to be able to get online, I'm not positive, but we'll definitely get some of it. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I'm looking for, anyone have any questions? So far, I'm not seeing any other questions. I have another question. And so it's sort of perfect that I don't see any others at the moment, but I'm really interested in translation, and I myself have done some translating from Spanish to English and German to English in years and years ago. And I'm just wondering, in this whole discussion, how much does translation, I mean, maybe this is a really obvious question, but I'm really curious about what role does, and this was mentioned earlier in the day in another session, the role of the translator. So how much is this something that is necessarily a part of this question when we're looking at collections in the United States? If any of you want to share some thoughts about that.
Sure. Well, we have discussed in this. We think that definitely the distance between the names and the categories used in the Spanish language and the categories used in English to describe works that can be considered part of science fiction is also part of one of these anxieties that we're talking about when we talk about labeling or retro labeling, as Rachel Hable Ferreira puts it. How to decide what is going to enter the conversation is sometimes related with how we translate these categories and how do we understand the development of this genre in the different regions. For instance, in Latin America, we can see that it's much more hybrid genre for a long time, influenced by the relationship with the fantastic and with some forms of even with some forms of realism, like magical
realism. Right.
Exactly. So I think that it definitely affects the translation at an editorial level, but also when we have to put together the corpus that will inform the archive. And I think that came up in the conversations we interviewed a lot of people, not only people from these two collections. So I don't know if
yeah, I guess, I mean, I don't have any big insights on that, but I do think that I guess I'm surprised how little translation there is from Latin American science fiction. I mean, there's definitely some, really great texts that have gotten translated, but it really, I mean, it's a handful. I don't understand it. I don't understand why it is so. I mean, other than just the myopic reading of U.S. readers.
Right. Right.
There's also an interesting, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I thought you, yeah.
Go ahead.
There's also an interesting a sort of anthology called Cosmos Latinos by Yolanda Molina Gavilan, that I guess it's the first like translation anthology.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Translation anthology.
Do you mind posting that in the chat for people to see? Actually, there had been a question that if there are authors that any of you would like us to, look for, you want to make suggestions for readers. And also now I'm sort of thinking, okay, that's a gap that maybe some of us should try to fill, is translating Latinx science fiction. As it's obviously, I mean, this, I think what you're saying is really crucial, of course, Matthew, that this kind of what we think of, what we're supposed to read, and who's controlling what we're asked to read, et cetera, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a couple of anthologies that they're mostly focused on Latinx writers in the US, but definitely some that sort of have ties to both the US and Latin America, or the US and the Caribbean. So my work falls a little bit in between, the US and Latin America in that sense. And some of the works in Latinx Visions, Latinx Rising, Speculative Fiction for Dreamers, some of the anthologies that I've done are definitely, they're translated.
Right.
But yeah, in terms of novels, yeah, it really is just a handful. And I guess I keep sort of waiting for a big push to happen. And it hasn't happened
you
yet.
can do that. We're here. We're receptive.
Yes, all my free time, I'll do that.
Of course. Right. Thank you so much. Thank you for posting that. No, that's really, thank you all. It was really, really fascinating. I'm really happy that I could be here. And I think Jason just posted. Oh yeah. Excellent. And I'll think about going back to translation, and there we go. There's maybe I'll email you with some questions, and I really would like to read this novel that you mentioned. Thank you all for your really invaluable work. This was so fascinating. So we have 3 minutes if anyone wants to add any last thoughts or suggestions, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, I guess maybe the one little bright spot in that area is, I think that there is a growing market for Spanish readers in the US.
Absolutely.
And some of that is they're coming, primarily small presses, micro presses even.
Right.
But so there is that little movement. I'm not sure how large that will get, but it's at least present as opposed to 15 years ago.
Right.
So.
Right. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for these great presentations. I mean, it's enlightening to me. I want to learn more about Latinx SF now, and I'm probably going to start with this anthology. Also, it's great that there's the other events that Matthew, you're talking about, because I mean, this is what's great about this kind of event, is not just that we're sharing things here, but we can also network out and promote the sharing that's taking place at other places, get more discussions taking place. So right now it's 4:09. So if we can take a 5-minute break, we will start the keynote address at 4:15 with Jeremy Brett, who we're very fortunate to join us today to give us the keynote address. So hang in there. I appreciate all of you, sticking in throughout the day. I know that if your experience is like mine, an online symposium to me drains me a lot more than whenever we're actually in person. So I know it's a Herculean task to make it through the day, but we're almost there, and I'm looking forward to Jeremy Brett's keynote address in a moment. So we'll get started with that at 4:15. Thanks.